I'd like to introduce you to our speakers for today. First up will be Margaret Kearns. She is a senior environmental scientist with over 20 years of experience who has been with Corona for the last 6 years. She manages the water resources team with a focus area in source water protection, GIS, data management, and modeling. Next up will be Jennifer Benjamin, and she is an environmental scientist with a background in environmental science and policy analysis. And for the past 5 years, she has aided in the development of source water threat inventories for over 50 water utilities across the United States, providing data collection and processing, GIS analysis, training, and also consulting services. And last, but certainly not least, is Jim Henderson. And he is a senior water resource economist with more than 20 years of experience assisting water utilities and governmental clients with water resource planning and economics. And Mr. Henderson specializes in benefit cost analysis, business case evaluation, water demand analysis, source water protection, green infrastructure, stormwater management, and asset management. I am the one that is going to be navigating through the screens, so it's going to take me a second to get switched over to that, but without further hesitation, I would like to hand it over to Margaret Kearns.
Thanks, Shawnee, and thanks to everybody for joining us today for our presentation. We're going to begin by going over the objectives of today's presentation, and hopefully it will come up in just a minute here. Shawnee, we're just seeing your face at the moment. All right, there we go. All right, so thanks for joining us for a presentation on the practical approach to identifying potential PFAS sources. We will be covering a little bit of background about PFAS. If you are new to the issue, though, there will be a link to our previous webinar on this last spring, where we went more into detail on the background of PFAS and the regulatory environment for drinking water utilities, as well as some approaches to treatment and case studies. So that will be available as one of the resources at the end of our presentation. But today we're really going to focus on the approach to identifying potential sources of PFAS. Next slide, Shawnee. So we'll cover the objectives of a PFAS source inventory project, some of the methods and lessons we've learned from applying this at a number of utilities, how to use a PFAS source inventory, what to do with that data once you get it, and then some takeaways and resources at the end. Next slide. So brief review, what are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, we known as PFAS? These are a group of man-made chemicals, include PFOA, PFOS, GenX, and many others, thousands of others, in fact. There are new ones being developed all the time as well. They're manufactured and used around the globe since about the 1940s in an array of industrial processes as well as consumer goods. They're very persistent in the environment and the human body. They do bioaccumulate over time and also break down very slowly. Next slide. And one of the reasons that we're most concerned about is because they do also have a whole suite of health outcomes that are still being researched, but as of now, we have information that in laboratory animals, there are reproductive and developmental liver and kidney and immunological effects. PFOA and PFOS in particular have caused tumors in animals. And among human populations, the most consistent findings are increased cholesterol levels, and more limited findings related to low infant birth weights, effects on the immune system, cancer, and thyroid hormone disruption. So there are a whole host of health outcomes that make this a hot topic for the public health world. And you certainly know that this is showing up in the press these days. Next slide, Shawnee. There's a lot of activity at the federal level as well as the state level, and it's really getting into the public eye, not just the drinking water community. This is an article from the Boston Globe. This was the cover page of the Boston Globe just last week on the 1st. And it says toxic forever chemicals found in pesticide used on millions of Massachusetts acres when spraying for mosquitoes. This is an interesting one where they tested this particular product and they found very high levels of PFOA and PFOS. They went back to the manufacturer. The manufacturer reviewed their formula for the product. They reviewed their supply chain and the formulas for the materials that they were getting. And they said, no, we're absolutely not adding any perfluorinated compounds to our product. And we don't know where it's coming from. So this one is still kind of a mystery. And I think it really highlights sort of the evolving nature of our knowledge about PFAS right now. This is a source that people wouldn't necessarily think of, and it's obviously a source that even the manufacturers think there is not PFAS in there. So the fate of these chemicals and how they move through the environment is still an area of active study, and it is coming up in the public eye, and so you may be getting questions about this topic. Next slide, Shani. So why conduct a PFAS source water inventory? We have slightly different perspectives depending on whether you're a water utility or a state or federal agency. Both perspectives share the public health concern and challenges of public relations and strategic communications, and making sure that when you do develop your communications plan for PFAS, that you're really basing that on the best science of the day and the most data that you can have at your fingertips. For water utilities, you also want to understand the distribution of source types in order to anticipate regulations that are coming or comply with current regulations and understand where the sources of contamination may be coming from. To better understand if you have detections or past contamination incidents, where that might be coming from, in order to develop source water protection programs or efforts, and also to identify PFAS contributors to wastewater facilities. So it's not just water utilities that are dealing with this issue right now, because wastewater has been identified as a significant source of PFAS being discharged into the environment. There is work going on actively right now for the wastewater utilities to try and identify what's being discharged to them, whether there are pretreatment processes that they can put in place with some of the industrial discharges to those sewage treatment plants. And then last, but certainly not least, this one comes up high in every case that we work with, is treatment cost recovery. If you do have PFAS contamination for, over the regulation right now, or close to regulatory limits, or close to limits that you anticipate to be regulatory limits in the future, you're starting to look at treatment and the cost of implementing that treatment, and looking toward cost recovery, either responsible parties at particular point sources of PFAS, or for manufacturers who may have been responsible in a more general way for putting PFAS out into the environment. And those costs can also affect your budget estimates and assessment of affordability to your ratepayers in the off chance you don't find somebody with deep pockets who is responsible and can help you pay for this. Next slide, Johnny. So if you're a state or federal agency, you certainly share the drinking water community's concern for public health, and you have your own strategic communications issues around this subject matter area. But you really want to understand the distribution of source types for a little bit different reason. They may be trying to develop a particular regulation, trying to understand which industries or activities it might affect. You may be trying to design sampling programs to have a better understanding of the extent of problems across the state. You may be working with wastewater treatment plants, trying to develop industrial pretreatment programs, or looking at cleanup programs or other related programs, and the funding needs for all of these, and the extent of contamination and locations of potential PFAS sources can be a big driver for how big an issue this is, and what extent to what extent you need to go to with these different types of programs. Next slide. All right, so I wanted to give a shout out to American Water Works Association's Source Water Evaluation Guide for PFAS. This just came out this year. It's a great little guide. It has a good, literature summary of a lot of topics related to finding sources of PFAS and our current understanding of the nature of these sources and pathways by which they can come into contact with human consumption. They break it out into 4 steps for source water evaluation. The first being evaluate available data, identify potential sources, establish a monitoring program, and interpret the results. In our talk today, we're really going to focus on these first 2, evaluating the available data and identifying those potential sources. But we just want to point out that this is part of a larger process to establish a monitoring program, interpret results, and actually take action. Next slide. All right, so at this point, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Jennifer Benjamin, who has been helping us out, really implementing this inventory method and developing it and improving it as we go with a number of utility clients. Here you go, Jen. Jen, you're still muted. Sorry.
How's that? Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's much better.
Great. So thanks, Margaret. So Corona has developed a fairly simple method that water utilities can use to identify potential sources of PFAS in their watersheds. And there are 5 key steps to this methodology. The first step is to first define your study area. And if you're looking to identify sources of PFAS as part of either a source water protection program or an emergency response planning program, then you very likely already have a zone of concern or a wellhead protection area. And that's a great place to start if you're not sure where to start with, defining your study area. You can also set your study area to a radius around your wellhead or intake. Or you might decide to expand your search to either maybe your entire watershed or maybe your county or multiple counties. It's really up to you. But one important thing to keep in mind is that your study area is ultimately going to determine the amount of data that you need to collect and review. And so if you're really strapped for time, it's probably best, at least the first time around, to limit your study area to a smaller area, like your zone of concern or wellhead protection area. And then once your study area is defined, then you then need to figure out what types of PFAS you're interested in. And a good place to start is by looking at which PFAS, if any, have been regulated in your state. PFAS are becoming increasingly regulated. So if your state is either already regulating PFAS or thinking about regulating PFAS, that's a great place to start when you're putting together a list of PFAS of interest. You can also look at what has been actually detected in your watershed. So you can rely on your own sampling data if you've done any sort of PFAS sampling in your watershed. You can also look at what other utilities have done in your area. And then there are also some great nationwide sources of PFAS sampling data out there. One great reliable source is the PFAS Contamination Site Tracker map, which was developed by the Environmental Working Group in Northeastern University. That's publicly available online, and it has a lot of good data. So that's another reliable source if you're not sure what PFAS you want to focus on. That's a good place to look to see what's actually been detected in your area. And then once you know what PFAS you're interested in, the next step is to then identify high-risk industry sources of PFAS. And this will help you to figure out the types of data resources that you need to collect and review. Once you identify those high-risk industries that you want to target, you can then look for data sets from state, federal, and local agencies in your area that'll help you to identify facilities within those high-risk industries. And the data sets that you collect are likely to have been collected for purposes other than PFAS source identification. So in that case, you're very likely going to have to then filter those data sets that you collect in order to remove any irrelevant or low risk facilities that they include. And then the last step in this process is to do a web search for facilities belonging to companies that have been historically known to either use or manufacture PFAS. And the goal of this task is really to fill in gaps in your inventory and make sure that you're capturing facilities that you know are PFAS manufacturers, but that might not have been captured by the data sets you've collected for whatever reason. So that includes big name companies like 3M, DuPont, companies that have been known to manufacture and use PFAS for many years. Another kind of side goal of this task is benefit of this task is that it will also help you to pull in manufacturers that might be manufacturing PFAS replacement chemicals, especially because if you're focusing on looking for sources of very specific PFAS, you might not be pulling in facilities that are also manufacturing PFAS replacement chemicals. So this is a way of capturing some of those big manufacturing facilities that might also be manufacturing those replacement chemicals. Now, of course, when you're applying this method, the study area and the PFAS of interest are really going to vary depending on where in the country you're looking for PFAS sources. But as far as high-risk industry sources of PFAS, we have put together a list of some target industries that we think anyone can use, regardless of which PFAS they're looking for. On the next slide. So this is a list of high-risk industries that we've identified based on discussions with experts in the water industry who have done work with tracing PFAS detections back to their sources. And a lot of these industries were targeted specifically because they're likely users of AFFF firefighting foams, which, if you don't know, is one of the more prevalent and well-known sources of PFAS. So that category includes things like firefighting training facilities and fire stations, airports, especially the larger airports that have a lot of get a lot of traffic. So the large commercial airports, and also military facilities. And then there are other industries on this list that were included because they're considered to be indirect sources of PFAS, either because they handle solid wastes that may contain PFAS, or they're handling wastewater that might contain PFAS. So that includes things like the landfills and solid waste facilities, incinerators, major wastewater dischargers and wastewater treatment plants, and also biosolids production and application sites. And then a lot of the rest of the industries on this list were identified because they are likely to be using PFAS in manufacturing. So a lot of these industries are doing some sort of production of products that have some sort of either nonstick or performance coating on them. So that would include things like chrome and metal plating facilities, polymer production and dyeing facilities, paper coating manufacturers, carpet manufacturers, non-stick coating manufacturers, outdoor and high performance fabric and clothing manufacturers, food contact paper production facilities, and then we also have dry cleaners on the list as well. Next slide. So once we identified a set of high-risk industries, we have reviewed federal and data resources for data that could potentially help us to identify facilities that are within those high-risk industries. And for federal data sources, we have relied primarily on the US EPA, Department of Homeland Infrastructure. We also found some useful data from the Federal Aviation Administration. So these are some of the federal data sets that we found to be most useful. Of course, if you were to apply this method yourself, you would need to do your own data source review to collect any relevant data that are specific to your area. But of course, the federal data resources are open to everyone across the country. So these should be available to you regardless of where you're looking for PFAS sources. So as far as federal sources, we found a lot of our fire station and military facility data at the federal level. So that includes things like military facilities from the Department of Homeland Infrastructure, fire stations and training sites from the Department of Homeland Infrastructure. As I said, we also got some useful airport data from the Federal Aviation Administration. One of the most useful federal data resources that we found was the Enforcement and Compliance History Online database, so the ECHO database. That is available through the US EPA. That was particularly useful to us because it includes compliance information for just about every permitted industry, so just about every industry that's permitted through the US EPA. And so it includes facilities across several industries. It also includes NICS industry codes, which allows us to filter that database by industry type. So it's very easy to pinpoint the facilities that are within our target high-risk industries. We also, from federal sources, we were also able to get some federal permitting data related to hazardous chemical storage. So that would include things like Tier 2 hazardous chemical storage data from the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. We also used the toxic release inventory data from the EPA and Toxic Substances Control Act data. And then we also looked at UCMR sampling data as well. Now, as far as state data resources, again, the data that's available from the state is going to vary depending on where you're looking for PFAS sources. State agencies can really vary quite a bit. But generally, we find that you can find some data related to manufacturing facilities that are regulated through state programs. You can also typically find data that's related to those indirect sources of PFAS through state data sources. So that would include the wastewater data, wastewater treatment plants, and also things like waste facilities, so landfills, solid waste transfer facilities, things like that. Next slide. And then a lot of state agencies have also done their own PFAS assessments or surveys. So it's worth taking a look at what your own state has already done in your area if you're not sure where to begin. And so some states have PFAS sampling programs where they've gone out and looked at where PFAS has been detected, either in soil or in water systems. Other states have looked at or looked specifically for PFAS manufacturers, usually by doing some sort of survey of manufacturers across the state to ask manufacturers if they actually use or have PFAS on site. And then other states have done some sort of combination of the two. So again, it really depends on the state where you're working. And then there are also some great publicly available sources of detection data out there, as I mentioned previously, which you can use to identify PFAS that have been detected in your area. And again, one of the ones that we found to be most useful was the PFAS contamination site tracker map from the Environmental Working Group, which is run through Northeastern University. And again, that's a publicly available online map. So it's open to everyone, and it includes voluntarily submitted data related to PFAS detection sites. Next slide. So once you've collected all of the relevant data that is available to you, the next step is to then filter your data down to remove any low risk or non-risk facilities that have been included in the data sets you've collected. And there are a number of different approaches you can take to filter your data. When we apply this method, we generally apply a combination of several different data filtering approaches. And the approach that we use for any one particular data set really depends on the information that, the type and the amount of information that comes with the data set from the source. So generally, if a data set comes with data fields that'll help us to determine whether or not a facility is within one of our target high-risk industries, or that help us evaluate risk in some way, then we'll use the provided data fields to filter the data. So some examples of the kinds of fields that we'll use to filter the data would include things like facility type fields, fields indicating what types of chemicals are being stored or used on site. And then for wastewater facilities in particular, we'll also look for fields that indicate discharge volumes, because that'll give us an idea of it'll give us an idea of facility size and the amount of material that's moving through the facility on a regular basis. And then other data sets come with or can be matched to NICS and SIC industry codes. And those data sets are usually the easiest to filter because we can filter those data sets down to the records that have codes that are representative of those high-risk industries that we're targeting. And then it's also not uncommon to encounter data that are in formats that aren't easily filtered using electronic means. And so those sources typically have to be manually reviewed, meaning you have to manually add the relevant records from those sources to your inventory. And so that would include things like online maps, like that PFAS contamination site tracker map that we talked about, as well as any PDF map or PDF reports that you might encounter. And it's not uncommon to encounter state level PFAS assessments that are in PDF format. We found that to be fairly common. And then when applying this method ourselves, we found that there are often sources that we don't filter at all, either because we find that all of the data are relevant, meaning that they are all potential, or all the facilities that are captured by the data set are potential sources of PFAS. So it's not worth filtering any of those facilities out. And then in other cases, we find that the data simply doesn't come with enough information to allow us to filter it. So in those cases, if we still find the data set to be relevant to our study, then we'll still include it. We just won't filter it. Next slide. And then the final step in the process is to fill in gaps in your inventory by searching directly for known PFAS manufacturers by name. And again, this is to help make sure that you're capturing some of those known PFAS manufacturers that might have been, for whatever reason, excluded by the data that you've collected. So let's say you're in your particular state, the amount of data available to you is very limited. This is a good way of making sure that you're still capturing some of those well-known sources of PFAS. So if you were to conduct a similar search, you may wish to add to this list, but this table at the top here includes some of the companies that we recommend targeting. Now, out of these, we find that DuPont, Chemours, Solvay, and 3M, so those first four on the list, are particularly prevalent in the US. Saint-Gobain is also fairly common. Some of the others tend to do a lot of their manufacturing overseas, as far as we've seen, but they're still worth looking for as they are known manufacturers of PFAS. And then we recommend starting the search by doing a search in Google Maps for each company by name, just to pull up locations that are registered with Google Maps. You can also search for some of the major brand names, and the major brand names are often listed on the company website. So if you want to go looking for them, they are usually easy to find. Once we pull up our search results in Google Maps, we'll then typically manually review these search results using aerial and street level imagery to try to remove facilities that appear to be corporate offices or retail locations, because these presumably carry little to no risk. So the goal is really to pinpoint facilities that are likely or seem like they could be involved in manufacturing. And then we'll typically follow the search up by doing a keyword search in Google Maps to look for facilities that have keywords in their name that seem to indicate that they're in one of our target high-risk industries. So we listed some examples at the bottom of the slide here. We'll look for things, facilities that have things like coatings, plating, chemical, or foams in the name. And then again, we'll manually review our search results to pull out anything that is irrelevant or appears to be just a corporate office or a retail location. Next slide. And then we'll usually finish off our manufacturing facility search with these last two steps here. So we'll first look for state databases that, or databases available from the state that allow us to search across several state programs at once by entering in a either keyword or a company name. So not every state has this type of database. The type of thing, an example of the type of thing that we're looking for would be the EPA's FRS database. So the EPA's FRS database allows you to search across multiple federal permit programs just by entering in either a facility name or a facility ID. So we tend to look for something similar at the state level that'll allow us to enter in each of those company names on our target list of manufacturers and use that to search across multiple state programs for the manufacturers on our list. And then we'll finish off just by looking at the company websites for each of those target manufacturers. So we'll go to each of the company websites and look for listed locations. And then we'll again look up those locations on Google Maps to try to figure out whether or not they are corporate offices or retail locations, because again, we really want to pinpoint those manufacturing locations. And in some cases, the company websites will actually distinguish the manufacturing locations from other types of facilities, which is especially helpful. All right, next slide. So this is just to give you a sense of some of what typical results might look like. So this is what typical results might look like for a typical suburban and rural area. So where there's not a lot of industry going on. So this particular area is very forested. You can see that there aren't a ton of manufacturing facilities, but there are still quite a few potential sources of PFAS, mostly in the form of facilities that are likely to be using AFFF firefighting foams. So you can see on this particular map, there are a lot of fire stations, for example. Next slide. And so this is a map of what a more urban or industrial area where there's a lot more manufacturing going on. So just to give you a sense of what our results typically look like when we're working in a more urban environment. So you can see that there's a lot more variety in the types of PFAS sources that we identified. There are a lot more manufacturing facilities in particular. There are still a lot of fire stations because no matter where you work, there are always going to be a lot of fire stations. That seems to be the norm. You might also notice that on this list we have, so those purple dots there are at poultry slaughtering and processing facilities. That's a bit of a weird one. So poultry slaughtering and processing facilities are added to the list specifically because apparently when there is disease outbreak at those types of facilities, a common practice to exterminate diseased chickens is to cover the chickens with firefighting foam. So in their day-to-day operations, those aren't typically going to be PFAS sources, but if there's any sort of disease outbreak, they could potentially be a pretty significant source of PFAS. So that is why those facilities are included on the list. All right. So I am going to turn things back to Margaret. She's going to be talking about filling in data gaps.
Okay, thanks, Jen. So at this point, you have a relatively long list of potential sources of PFAS in your study area, and you're really looking to narrow that down to which ones are the more significant risks and which ones are less significant. And so you're starting to look at filling data gaps and looking at some of these facility types in more detail. So some of the steps we recommend for industrial facilities, we would say look at safety data sheets for any chemicals that you know they store on site that you may have found through the data review that you did of like the EPCRA's hazardous chemical storage data or toxics release inventory data or TSCA data. You can review the 2021 toxics release inventory submissions. We've got a slide coming up on this, but there are changes coming to that program that should make those much more useful in the coming months. For wastewater treatment plants, generally want to focus on the large and industrial discharges, not so much on like individual septic, unless you're in a very rural area and that's one of your more major sources. And again, if there are industrial discharges, taking a look at whether there's any industrial pretreatment standard program that can be put in place or agreements that can be made to reduce those emissions to wastewater treatment plants. For dry cleaners, similarly, you want to determine the discharge location. Are they discharging to septic or sewer? Because that's going to affect the location of any impact from dry cleaners. For dry cleaners, the issue is not necessarily the chemicals that they're using to clean the clothes. It's the clothes themselves that have been treated with a lot of these sort of nonstick and waterproof materials that then wash off as they're doing the dry cleaning and end up in their waste stream. For incinerators, you need to understand whether you're downwind of an incinerator. These can certainly affect large areas. It seems like the incineration temperature and process really has an effect on whether PFAS are broken down or not during this process. So you really need to kind of get into the details of what's happening at each of these incinerators and what areas are typically downwind of them. For solid waste facilities, land application sites, perk ponds have sort of similar needs. Again, you want to identify the waste stream sources. Are there any like major industrial dischargers to those solid waste streams? Determine whether the facility is lined or not. And if it is lined, understand whether there's an effluent treatment system and the discharge location from any effluent that's coming from that facility. And again, review industrial pretreatment standards to the waste stream if that's an option for you. And then applicable to sort of, all of your higher risk facilities and land uses that you come up with at this point. Getting a meeting with a representative is certainly really helpful. Not always possible. Not everybody's going to be amenable to talking to you about PFAS because it is such a hot button topic. But if you can, some of the things to think about are, certainly the use of firefighting foams, and large fires, the history of fires on site, whether they store firefighting foams on site, what type of foam they use. And then for more industrial facilities, just what products are used in the manufacturing that's going on site, and where do they get discharged to, and how are they handled on site? And are there any efforts underway to reduce the use of PFAS or move to other replacement chemicals? And then finally, sample strategically. Once you identify some, things that you think might be potential sources, bracket those sources. If they're point source type locations, you can bracket them, or even just sample strategically in terms of where you have, major groundwater areas, or where you have major tributaries meeting larger rivers, if you're a surface water source. Next slide. So we did want to briefly talk about some of the changes that have happened to the toxics release inventory that are going to be becoming useful, hopefully this summer. So in 2020, the National Defense Authorization Act added another 172 PFAS to the toxics release inventory reporting requirements. So if they're storing more than 100 pounds of any of these PFAS above the minimum 1% concentration or 0.1% for PFOA, they'll need to report those. Those first forms are due in July of 2021 and will cover releases that happened during calendar year of 2020. The EPA has a great website, and they do seem to be keeping it up to date. This is an area for EPA that is, actively being pursued. PFAS regulation and PFAS data management in general is something that EPA has been focused on for the last several years and will continue to be focused on. So there are some good reporting exemptions. There's a link here that you can go to and look into it. It includes things like, manufactured items. So if you go and buy a coat that's treated with Gore-Tex, the facility that's selling the coat doesn't have to report. However, whoever's manufacturing the material does. Like if you just have a firefighting system that uses AFFF foam, that's not a reportable use. However, if you actually use it or test it, that is. So there are some unique exemptions that are good to know about if you are going to work with this data. It's worth reviewing the EPA's webpage. They also have a page of regulatory changes that are expected. So as we move forward, they do expect to be adding additional PFAS contaminants to the list of contaminants that will need to be reported under various programs. So for instance, when they finalize a toxicity value for a PFAS, or if there are new significant new use rules under TSCA, or new chemicals get identified as active chemicals for the TSCA inventory. So there are some changes that are expected, and it will we do expect this to be sort of fluid in the years to come as to which PFAs need to be reported and which ones are not included. Next slide. All right, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jim to talk about next steps.
Great, thank you, Margaret. Yeah, I'd like to give you a quick outline here of potential next steps to take after developing this PFAS inventory. We'll start with next steps for the utility, and then also get to a potential list of steps for the state to take as well. So after developing this PFAS inventory, it's a great building block to start to work through and address concerns for your utility. So the inventory can really help point you towards identifying potential voluntary sampling locations, strategically sampling, as Margaret was talking about earlier. And you can start to get an idea of where concerns might be in your service area. Once you start to get an idea of potential concerns and the concentrations associated with that, might be able to start to identify possible changes in treatment that might be helpful or necessary for your utility. There's a presentation that Corona had developed earlier in this year talking about options for treatment for PFAS, generally looking at granular activated carbon and ion exchanges as possibilities there, but there's a lot more on that in the webinar, which in the list of resources at the end of this presentation, there'll be a link to being able to view that webinar for a lot more information on potential treatment options there. Another potential next step is identifying investments that might be needed at sources in the watershed. So these might be investments that potential polluters might need to make in order to help address releases, as well as potential investments that the utility might want to participate in order to try to address problems. Next step here is potentially looking at the costs associated with sampling, with potential treatment, with potential mitigation approaches, and looking at the potential impact on the utility's budget. Hopefully there'll be some more cost recovery options that you might be able to get the polluters to be able to contribute and help meet those needs in terms of reducing those sources. But there's also possibility that the utility might need to make an investment beyond that cost recovery. And so this is potentially looking at the impact of that cost beyond the cost recovery on the utilities budget. And then one thing we wanted to mention was a particular capability that Corona has to look at potential impacts from those costs on rates, and being able to conduct an affordability assessment. This is looking at the ability of households within the community to afford potential costs, increase in costs, and being able to look at this analysis looks at the prevalence of low-income households and the bill burden associated with the water and wastewater bill compared to the full list of spending that they need to make in a month or so, and being able to look at the potential change from investment in mitigating PFAS and what additional burden that might contribute to the affordability burden for households. So that's a quick summary of that type of analysis. We're going to have our colleague Janet Clements is going to be presenting on affordability coming up very soon in January, and so you want to we'll send out notices to let you know when that presentation would be. But she'll be talking about potential changes in rate structures that might be able to be used to be able to address affordability concerns, as well as customer assistance programs to help address those with the highest bill burden and the lowest incomes in your service area. So those are two good possibilities. Next slide is potential next steps from the state. This is based on Corona had contributed to development of Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, developed a toolkit and guide for contaminants of emerging concern, and we use PFAS as an example there for rural development and management strategies that states might be able to undertake. So this is some of the things from that guide, and again, in our list of resources at the end of this, there's a link to the guide and toolkit on the ASDA website, and so you'll be able to follow that there. So this inventory can help direct targeted sampling investment for the state and help to understand where prevalence of PFAS might be in the state, and that information can eventually help the state when they want to start moving towards more of a regulatory approach, creating a statewide sampling plan to get a more complete idea of PFAS occurrence within the state. Then once you know that those concentrations, and you can start to estimate potential treatment investments and mitigation actions that might be needed and their potential cost. And then also perform economic analyses to describe that potential benefit of regulatory choices that are made. And if you're moving on to developing an MCL, then can actually help. Benefit cost analysis can be used to help support development of the maximum contaminant level for the PFAS. So just those are some of the potential contributions there for the approach from the state. So I'll pass it back to Margaret here to finish up and talk about takeaways from the presentation.
All right, great. So we've laid a lot on you in this hour, and we're all fast talkers. So I wanted to wrap it up with some of the takeaways. I think one of the biggest takeaways is that this is an area that's evolving rapidly. Our knowledge of what constitutes a PFAS source is evolving rapidly, as are regulations. And as a result of that, the new data are becoming available at a rapid pace. Right now, states and utilities are actively sampling for PFAS. We do expect additional data to become available in the coming years. And again, the toxics release inventory, the changes to that legislation means that this year's reports should be much more helpful than in the past, and should help to shed some more light on what specific PFAS are being used at particular locations. Next slide, Shani. In addition to sort of the pace of understanding of sources of PFAS, Some of the takeaways that hopefully you'll get from today's talk is that it is possible to identify industry sources from raw data that are meant for other purposes. It can be detailed and time consuming to try and dig in and get out as much information as you can to winnow out some of those lower priority or not applicable data from these data sets. But there is information out there to help you, hone in on some of these industry types that we know are, possibly using PFAS and generating PFAS releases. The manufacturers of replacement chemicals are not easy to identify from regulatory data sets. This is both due to the pace of development and also sort of regulatory loopholes for confidential business information and that sort of thing. And so this is why we went to the piece of the method that Jen talked about, where we're looking for specific companies that we know are active in development and research related to replacement chemicals, because many of these share some of the same health impacts of more traditional PFAS. And so that is also an area to keep an eye out for. Doesn't currently have regulatory hooks to it, but those are probably the things that are going to be regulated, in the next generation for us. Finding comprehensive PFAS source inventory is a useful tool to help you stay ahead of the curve for a number of things. Public relations and communications is a big one. Regulatory and cost recovery purposes, also high on the minds of many of the utilities we work with. And then also to help design your monitoring program to isolate sources and get a better understanding of where any contamination you might be seeing is coming from. And once you do identify that you have an issue or have an issue in a particular area, other analyses that might be helpful are looking at the treatment costs and options, and then looking at the impact of that on your rate structure and the economic and affordability analysis for your ratepayers. Next slide, Shani. So last, we want to leave you with a slide of some of the resources we talked about. These are all kind of live links. Shani will be sending out links to this, which I will let her explain the process of how to get hold of that for herself. But these are some of the things that we talked about that we found really helpful, and hopefully you will too. Next slide. Finally, we just want to acknowledge everybody here at Corona who contributed content to this. The team that's here right now, as well as some of our process engineers, Alman Ghosh, Tara Henry, and Chad Seidel, who provided some of the background information, and also worked on the presentation from last spring that really got into more detail on treatment processes and the regulatory history of PFAS. So I believe that's it, Shani. Are there any more slides after this?
That is all of the slides. And so now I'm going to ask Claire, did we have any questions that popped up?
We did not have any questions, just a request for some data to include when we send out.
Okay.
But if anybody has questions, now would be the time.
Now is the time. And if we see none, then the next step from here is I'm going to, we've been recording this, so I will be doing some slight edits to the recording and getting it posted online. And then my intention is by no later than tomorrow, sending you out a follow-up email that has the notes slides so that you also have the information for the resources and also the link to the presentation in the event you want to go back and share that with anybody or you want to look at it again. And of course, we would love to have any questions that you want to provide to us offline. So I'll have all of our contact information also available there. And with that said, I want to thank everybody so much for
Shani,
your time today. Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt. We did have a couple questions come in. If we have a minute.
Questions are great.
Okay. So one question from Krista Shearer says, since PFAS are not reported currently, is there a list of commonly co-occurring contaminants that help us filter databases?
That is a great question. I have not come across such a list. There are, for manufacturing facilities, there are components that go into the creation of PFAS. There are various lists that contain some of those chemical names, but I haven't seen any sort of commonly co-occurring contaminants. And that's really why we focus on the industry types that we know use some of these products.
Thanks, Margaret. And we have one more question from Chris Moody, who asked, generally speaking, what type of budget for a water system would you plan on having to do this? Assume this being maybe sampling or the process that we go through with our PFAS identification.
Yeah, for the PFAS inventory development, it kind of depends on where you are and how big an area you want to look at. and how many data sets that require. Some states have more data available, and so it will take you longer to go through it than others. In general, I mean, if I had to throw out a really ballpark number, I'd say like 40 to 60, but 1,000. But it really depends on the specifics of your situation and what you're trying to accomplish with your inventory.
Great, thank you, Margaret. And that looks like all the questions for now.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. And as I said, if you have any other questions that you think of later, we certainly would love to be able to answer those for you. And I want to thank you all so much for tuning in today. And I really hope everybody has a great end of the year. We hopefully will all make it through 2020 and have a happy holiday season. Thank you all so much.